In times of oppression and despair, an unlikely leader emerges, a child born under the threat of death, raised between two worlds, destined to change the course of history. This is the story of Moses, the man who defied an empire, freed a people and laid the foundations of a faith that endures to this day. Prepare for an epic journey of faith, courage, and redemption, as we explore the extraordinary life of this prophet who spoke face-to-face with God. The setting is ancient Egypt, a land of splendor and cruelty. The Hebrews, once honored guests, now groan under the weight of slavery. Pharaoh, fearing the growth of this foreign nation, orders an unthinkable atrocity. In the book of Exodus, chapter 1 verses 15 and 16 we read, "The king of Egypt said to the Hebrew midwives, whose names were Shiphrah and Puah, when you help the Hebrew women in childbirth and observe them on the delivery stool, if it is a boy, kill him, but if it is a girl, let her live." Amidst this terror, a woman from the tribe of Levi gives birth to a son. Exodus 2:2 tells us, "The woman became pregnant and gave birth to a son. When she saw that he was a fine child, she hid him for 3 months." Fear and maternal love intertwine in this act of silent defiance against Pharaoh's decree, but the concealment could not last forever. With a heavy heart, the mother makes a desperate decision. Exodus 2:3 describes, "But when she could hide him no longer, she got a papyrus basket for him, and coated it with tar and pitch. Then she placed the child in it, and put it among the reeds along the bank of the Nile." A touching scene unfolds by the river, where a mother entrusts her child to fate, or perhaps to God. Divine providence manifests in mysterious ways. Exodus 2:5-6 narrates, "Then Pharaoh's daughter went down to the Nile to bathe, and her attendants were walking along the riverbank. She saw the basket among the reeds, and sent her female slave to get it. She opened it and saw the baby. He was crying, and she felt sorry for him. 'This is one of the Hebrew babies,' she said." At this crucial moment, the baby's sister, who had been watching from a distance, acts with quick wit and wisdom. Exodus 2:7-8 records, "Then his sister asked Pharaoh's daughter, 'Shall I go and get one of the Hebrew women to nurse the baby for you?' 'Yes, go,' she answered. So the girl went and got the baby's mother. Thus, in an incredible twist of fate, the boy's own mother is called to raise him. Pharaoh's daughter, moved by compassion, decides to adopt the baby. Exodus 2:10 tells us, "When the child grew older, she took him to Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. She named him Moses, saying, 'I drew him out of the water.'" Moses, whose name means drawn out of the water, grows up between two worlds, Pharaoh's palace and his Hebrew heritage. In the Egyptian court, Moses receives a privileged education. Acts 7:22 gives us insight into his training. Moses was educated in all the wisdom of the Egyptians, and was powerful in speech and action. He learns the arts and sciences of Egypt, unknowingly preparing for the role he would later play. Yet, the duality of his identity, Hebrew by birth, Egyptian by upbringing, creates an internal tension. Moses grows aware of his origins and the suffering of his people. This awareness would shape his future actions and prepare him for the divine calling that lay ahead. Thus ends the childhood of Moses, a story of danger, providence, and divine purpose. The boy rescued from the waters of the Nile grows into a man educated in the ways of Egypt, but with a heart set on his people. The stage is set for the next act of this epic tale, where Moses will face a choice that will change not only his life, but the destiny of an entire nation. Moses' life in Pharaoh's palace was about to change dramatically. The young Hebrew prince, raised as an Egyptian, was about to make a decision that would alter the course of his life and his people's history. The book of Exodus, chapter 2, verse 11, transports us to this crucial moment. One day after Moses had grown up, he went out to where his own people were and watched them at their hard labor. He saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his own people, This scene of brutality awakened in Moses a fury that had lain dormant for years. The injustice against his people, which he had observed from afar, now unfolded before his eyes. Verse 12 continues, "Looking this way and that and seeing no one, he killed the Egyptian and hid him in the sand." This act of violence, born from a misdirected sense of justice, would mark the end of Moses' life as a prince of Egypt. He had crossed a line from which there would be no return. The next day, Moses witnessed a quarrel between two Hebrews and tried to intervene. The response he received revealed that his act of the previous day had not gone unnoticed. Exodus 2:14 records, "The man said, 'Who made you ruler and judge over us? Are you thinking of killing me as you killed the Egyptian?' Then Moses was afraid and thought, 'What I did must have become known.' Fear overtook Moses. His privileged position in the palace would not protect him from the consequences of his actions. Verse 15 tells us, "When Pharaoh heard of this, he tried to kill Moses, but Moses fled from Pharaoh and went to live in Midian." Thus began Moses' flight, a journey that would take him from the luxury of the palace to the harshness of the desert. Midian, a distant and arid land, became Moses' refuge. There, far from the intrigues of the palace and the suffering of his people, he would find a new purpose. Exodus 2:15-16 describes his arrival. Moses fled from Pharaoh and went to live in Midian, where he sat down by a well. Now a priest of Midian had 7 daughters, and they came to draw water and fill the troughs to water their father's flock. In this pastoral setting, Moses once again encountered injustice. Verse 17 recounts, "Some shepherds came along and drove them away, but Moses got up and came to their rescue and watered their flock." This act of kindness and courage caught the attention of the priest of Midian, known as Reuel, later called Jethro. Impressed by Moses' actions, Reuel invited him into his home. This invitation would change the course of Moses' life. Exodus 2:21-22 tells us, "Moses agreed to stay with the man, who gave his daughter Zipporah to Moses in marriage. Zipporah gave birth to a son, and Moses named him Gershom, saying, 'I have become a foreigner in a foreign land.' The name Moses gave to his son Gershom, which means foreigner, reveals much about his state of mind. Although he had found refuge and a new family in Midian, Moses still felt like a stranger, a man without a home. He had left behind his life of privilege in Egypt, but he was also separated from his suffering people. Moses' life in Midian was marked by simplicity and hard work. The man who once walked the corridors of power was now shepherding sheep in the desert. This period of exile was not merely an escape from Egyptian justice, but also a time of preparation. Far from the comforts of the palace and the oppression of his people, Moses learned valuable lessons about humility, patience, and survival in the wilderness, skills that would prove crucial in his future role as a leader. Years passed, and Moses' life fell into a quiet routine. He might have remained an anonymous shepherd in the desert of Midian, had it not been for an extraordinary encounter that was about to take place. Exodus 3:1 sets the scene for this encounter. Moses was tending the flock of Jethro, his father-in-law, the priest of Midian, and he led the flock to the far side of the desert, and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. It was on this mountain, far from everything familiar, that God chose to reveal himself to Moses in a way that would change not only his life, but the course of history. The divine calling was about to happen, and Moses, the prince-turned-shepherd, was about to become the deliverer of his people. Moses' story up to this point is one of contrasts and transformations. From a cradle on the Nile to the luxury of Pharaoh's palace. From the fiery justice that led him to kill an Egyptian, to the peaceful life of a shepherd in the desert of Midian. Every experience, every challenge, every change in circumstance served to shape the character of the man God would use to lead his people to freedom. The flight to Midian, which might have seemed like the end of Moses' story, was actually just the prelude to his true mission. In the silence of the desert, far from the eyes of the world, God was preparing his chosen servant for a task that seemed impossible: to challenge the most powerful empire of the time and lead an enslaved people to freedom. As Moses tended his sheep on the slopes of Mount Horeb, he had no idea that he was about to receive a calling that would change everything. The man who once fled Egypt in fear was about to be commissioned to return as God's spokesperson. The next chapter of his life would be marked by divine encounters, miraculous signs, and an epic confrontation with the power of Egypt. Thus ends this phase of Moses' life, the exile who found peace in the desert. But the desert was not his final destination, it was merely a place of preparation. The silence of the Midian desert was about to be shattered by an encounter that would change the course of history. Moses, the Egyptian prince turned shepherd, was about to receive a divine calling that would transform him into the deliverer of his people. The book of Exodus, chapter 3 verse 2, presents us with this extraordinary scene. The angel of the Lord appeared to him in flames of fire from within a bush. Moses saw that though the bush was on fire, it did not burn up. This unusual sight captured Moses' attention. The ordinary had become extraordinary, and the everyday had been invaded by the supernatural. Verses 3 and 4 continue. So Moses thought, "I will go over and see this strange sight, why the bush does not burn up." When the Lord saw that he had gone over to look, God called to him from within the bush, "Moses, Moses." And Moses said, "Here I am." In that moment, Moses found himself face to face with the God of his ancestors. The voice that echoed from the burning bush was not just a voice of authority, but a voice of covenant and promise. In verses 5 and 6, God reveals himself. "Do not come any closer. Take off your sandals, for the place where you are standing is holy ground. I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob." Moses' response was one of reverent fear. Moses hid his face because he was afraid to look at God. The God who spoke to Moses was not a stranger. He was the God who had made a covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. He was the God who had promised to make their descendants into a great nation. And now, after centuries of silence, he was about to fulfill his promise through Moses. In verses 7 to 10, God reveals his plan. The Lord said, "I have indeed seen the misery of my people in Egypt. I have heard them crying out because of their slave drivers, and I am concerned about their suffering. So I have come down to rescue them from the hand of the Egyptians, and to bring them up out of that land into a good and spacious land, a land flowing with milk and honey. So now go. I am sending you to Pharaoh to bring my people the Israelites out of Egypt." This divine calling caught Moses by surprise. The man who once thought he could liberate his people by his own strength now hesitated before the magnitude of the task. In verse 11, Moses expresses his insecurity. "Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt?" God's response in verse 12 is both a promise and a challenge. "I will be with you. And this will be the sign to you that it is I who have sent you. When you have brought the people out of Egypt, you will worship God on this mountain." God did not promise Moses that the task would be easy, but he promised his constant presence. Still hesitant, Moses asks another question in verse 13. "Suppose I go to the Israelites and say to them, 'The God of your fathers has sent me to you,' and they ask me, 'What is his name?' Then what shall I tell them?" God's response in verses 14 and 15 is one of the most profound revelations of his nature in all of Scripture. God said to Moses, "I am who I am. This is what you are to say to the Israelites. I am has sent me to you." God also said to Moses, "Say to the Israelites, 'The Lord, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac and the God of Jacob, has sent me to you. This is my name forever, the name you shall call me from generation to generation. The name I Am, in Hebrew, YHWH, often translated as Lord, reveals the eternal and unchanging nature of God. He is the God who always was, who is, and who always will be. This revelation of the divine name was not just an answer to Moses' question, but a declaration of who God is, the eternal God, faithful to his covenant, who was about to act on behalf of his people. In the following verses, God instructs Moses on how to approach the elders of Israel and Pharaoh. He also warns Moses that Pharaoh will not let the people go easily, but he promises to intervene with a mighty hand to deliver Israel. Despite these divine assurances, Moses remained hesitant. In chapter 4 verse 1, he expresses another concern. What if they do not believe me or listen to me and say, "The Lord did not appear to you"? In response, God grants Moses 3 miraculous signs to confirm his calling. The staff that turns into a snake, the hand that becomes leprous and is healed, and the water from the Nile that turns into blood. These signs were not only meant to convince the Israelites but also to strengthen Moses' faith in God's power working through him. Even with these miraculous signs, Moses still raises one last objection. In verse 10 he says, "O Lord, I have never been eloquent, neither in the past, nor since you have spoken to your servant. I am slow of speech and tongue." This admission reveals Moses' deep insecurity and sense of inadequacy for the task. God's response in verse 11 is both a challenge and a comfort. Who gave human beings their mouths? Who makes them deaf or mute? Who gives them sight or makes them blind? Is it not I, the Lord? Now go, I will help you speak and will teach you what to say. Yet, Moses makes one final plea in verse 13. O Lord, please send someone else. This final plea reveals how unprepared Moses felt for the task God had entrusted to him. God's response in verse 14 shows his anger, but also his grace. Then the Lord's anger burned against Moses, and he said, "What about your brother, Aaron the Levite? I know he can speak well. He is already on his way to meet you, and his heart will be glad when he sees you." In his wisdom and patience, God provides Moses with a spokesman in the person of his brother Aaron. In verses 15 and 16, God explains how this partnership will work. "You shall speak to him and put words in his mouth. I will help both of you speak, and will teach you what to do. He will speak to the people for you, and it will be as if he were your mouth and as if you were God to him." With this final provision, Moses' calling was complete. God had responded to each of his objections with patience and grace, providing everything Moses would need to fulfill his mission. The final verses of this chapter narrate Moses' return to Egypt. In verse 18 we read, "Then Moses went back to Jethro his father-in-law and said to him, 'Let me return to my own people in Egypt, to see if any of them are still alive.' Jethro said, 'Go, and I wish you well.'" Moses' journey back to Egypt was not without incidents. Along the way, a mysterious and troubling episode occurred. Verses 24-26 recount, "At a lodging place on the way the Lord met Moses and was about to kill him. But Zipporah took a flint knife, cut off her son's foreskin, and touched Moses' feet with it. 'Surely you are a bridegroom of blood to me,' she said. So the Lord let him alone. At that time she said, 'bridegroom of blood,' referring to circumcision. This enigmatic incident seems to be related to Moses' failure to circumcise his son, a vital sign of God's covenant with Abraham. It serves as a solemn reminder that even God's chosen leader must be obedient in all aspects of the covenant. Finally, Moses meets Aaron as God had promised. Verse 27 tells us, "The Lord said to Aaron, 'Go into the wilderness to meet Moses.' So he met Moses at the mountain of God and kissed him." Moses shares with Aaron everything that God had said, and the signs he had commanded. Together, they returned to Egypt to fulfill the mission God had entrusted to them. Moses' calling is a powerful narrative of how God works through ordinary people to accomplish his extraordinary purposes. Despite Moses' doubts and insecurities, God equipped him with everything he needed for the task ahead. The burning bush marked the beginning of a journey that would not only free the Israelites from slavery, but also reveal God's nature and character in unprecedented ways. As Moses approached Egypt, he was no longer just a runaway shepherd, but God's chosen one, commissioned with a task that would change the course of history. Moses' return to Egypt marked the beginning of one of the most dramatic confrontations in biblical history. Armed with divine authority and accompanied by his brother Aaron, Moses was about to challenge the power of the most powerful empire of his time. The book of Exodus, chapter 5 verse 1, introduces us to this epic confrontation. Afterward Moses and Aaron went to Pharaoh and said, "This is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. Let my people go, so that they may hold a festival to me in the wilderness." Pharaoh's response, recorded in verse 2, sets the tone for the conflict that would follow. Pharaoh said, "Who is the Lord, that I should obey him and let Israel go? I do not know the Lord, and I will not let Israel go." This direct challenge to the authority of Israel's God was not merely a political refusal, but a declaration of spiritual war. The first attempt at negotiation ended not only in failure, but in worsening the situation for the Israelites. Angered by Moses and Aaron's request, Pharaoh increased the oppression on the Hebrew slaves. In verses 6-9, we read his cruel order. That same day Pharaoh gave this order to the slave drivers and overseers in charge of the people: "You are no longer to supply the people with straw for making bricks. Let them go and gather their own straw, but require them to make the same number of bricks as before. Don't reduce the quota." This response put Moses in a difficult position. The people, now suffering even more because of his intervention, turned against him. In verse 21 the Israelites express their frustration. "May the Lord look on you and judge you. You have made us obnoxious to Pharaoh and his officials, and have put a sword in their hand to kill us." Shaken by this reaction, Moses turns to God in prayer. In chapter 5 verse 22, he laments, "Lord, why have you brought trouble on this people? Is this why you sent me? Ever since I went to Pharaoh to speak in your name, he has brought trouble on this people, and you have not rescued your people at all." God's response to this anguished prayer is a reaffirmation of his power and purpose. In chapter 6 verses 1-8, God renews his promise of deliverance. Then the Lord said to Moses, "Now you will see what I will do to Pharaoh. Because of my mighty hand, he will let them go. Because of my mighty hand, he will drive them out of his country." God also said to Moses, "I am the Lord. I appeared to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob as God Almighty, but by my name the Lord I did not make myself fully known to them. I also established my covenant with them to give them the land of Canaan, where they resided as foreigners. Moreover, I have heard the groaning of the Israelites, whom the Egyptians are enslaving, and I have remembered my covenant. So tell the Israelites, I am the Lord. I will bring you out from under the yoke of the Egyptians. I will free you from slavery and redeem you with an outstretched arm and with mighty acts of judgment. I will take you as my own people, and I will be your God. Then you will know that I am the Lord your God, who brought you out from under the yoke of the Egyptians. And I will bring you to the land I swore with uplifted hand to give to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob. I will give it to you as a possession. I am the Lord." This declaration from God was not only a promise of deliverance, but a deeper revelation of his character and purpose. The name Lord, YHWH, that God reveals here is the covenant name, signifying his faithfulness and unchanging commitment to his people. Strengthened by this renewal of the divine promise, Moses returned to Pharaoh. What followed was a series of dramatic confrontations, marked by the famous 10 plagues of Egypt. Each plague was not just a demonstration of God's power, but also a specific judgment against the gods of Egypt. The first plague, the turning of the Nile's waters into blood, is described in chapter 7 verses 22 to 21. Moses and Aaron did just as the Lord had commanded. He raised his staff in the presence of Pharaoh and his officials, and struck the water of the Nile, and all the water was changed into blood. The fish in the Nile died, and the river smelled so bad that the Egyptians could not drink its water. Blood was everywhere in Egypt. This plague was a direct attack on the god Hapi, the deity of the Nile, considered the source of life for Egypt. By turning the life-giving waters of the Nile into deadly blood, God demonstrated his power over Egypt's very source of life. The following plagues, frogs, gnats, flies, livestock disease, boils, hail, locusts, and darkness, each challenged specific aspects of Egyptian religion and life. Each plague was preceded by a warning to Pharaoh, giving him a chance to repent and release the people of Israel. The plague of frogs, for instance, described in chapter 8, was an attack on the goddess Heket, depicted with a frog's head and associated with fertility. The overwhelming number of frogs, normally seen as a blessing, became an unbearable curse. The plague of gnats, mentioned in chapter 8 verses 16 to 19, was particularly significant. Then the Lord said to Moses, "Tell Aaron, stretch out your staff and strike the dust of the ground, and throughout the land of Egypt the dust will become gnats." They did this, and when Aaron stretched out his hand with the staff and struck the dust of the ground, gnats came on people and animals. All the dust throughout the land of Egypt became gnats. But when the magicians tried to produce gnats by their secret arts, they could not. This was the first plague that the Egyptian magicians were unable to replicate, forcing them to admit, "This is the finger of God." This acknowledgement marked a turning point in the narrative, demonstrating the superiority of the God of Israel over Egypt's magical practices. The plague of darkness, described in chapter 10 verses 21-23, was a direct attack on Ra, the Egyptian sun god. Then the Lord said to Moses, "Stretch out your hand toward the sky, so that darkness spreads over Egypt, darkness that can be felt." So Moses stretched out his hand toward the sky, and total darkness covered all Egypt for 3 days. No one could see anyone else, or move about for 3 days. Yet all the Israelites had light in the places where they lived. This plague not only challenged one of Egypt's primary gods, but also foreshadowed the final judgment that was to come. Throughout these plagues, Pharaoh's heart wavered between moments of apparent repentance and renewed stubbornness. Several times he promised to let the people go, only to change his mind once the plague was lifted. Finally, God announced the 10th and most dreadful plague, the death of the firstborn. In chapter 11 verses 4-6, Moses declares to Pharaoh, "This is what the Lord says. About midnight I will go throughout Egypt. Every firstborn son in Egypt will die, from the firstborn son of Pharaoh, who sits on the throne, to the firstborn son of the female slave, who is at her handmill, and all the firstborn of the cattle as well. There will be loud wailing throughout Egypt, worse than there has ever been or ever will be again." This final plague would be preceded by the institution of the Passover, an event of profound theological and historical significance for Israel. In chapter 12, God instructs Moses on how the people are to prepare for this fateful night. Each family was to sacrifice a flawless lamb and place its blood on the doorposts and the lintel of their homes. Verses 12 and 13 explain the purpose of this ritual. "On that same night, I will pass through Egypt and strike down every firstborn of both people and animals, and I will bring judgment on all the gods of Egypt. I am the Lord. The blood will be a sign for you on the houses where you are, and when I see the blood, I will pass over you. No destructive plague will touch you when I strike Egypt. The night of Passover was a pivotal moment in Israel's history. While the angel of death passed through Egypt, taking the firstborn from every house not marked by the lamb's blood, the Israelites were kept safe, protected by the sacrificial blood. The impact of this final plague was devastating. Chapter 12, verse 30, describes the scene. Pharaoh and all his officials and all the Egyptians got up during the night, and there was loud wailing in Egypt, for there was not a house without someone dead. At last, Pharaoh relented. In verses 31 and 32 we read, "During the night, Pharaoh summoned Moses and Aaron and said, 'Up, leave my people, you and the Israelites. Go, worship the Lord as you have requested. Take your flocks and herds as you have said, and go, and also bless me.'" Thus began the Exodus, the dramatic departure of the Israelites from Egypt. Chapter 12, verse 37, gives us a sense of the scale of this event. The Israelites journeyed from Ramesses to Sukkoth. There were about 600,000 men on foot besides women and children. The confrontation with Pharaoh had ended, but Israel's journey was only beginning. Moses, the reluctant leader who once feared speaking before Pharaoh, now led an entire nation to freedom. This epic confrontation between Moses and Pharaoh is more than just a historical narrative. It is a powerful demonstration of God's power and faithfulness, His determination to fulfill His promises, and His ability to use ordinary people to accomplish extraordinary purposes. Through the plagues and the deliverance, God not only freed His people from physical bondage, but also from spiritual slavery to the gods of Egypt. Each plague was a declaration of the supremacy of the God of Israel over the powers that Egypt worshipped. For Moses, this confrontation was a journey of faith and growth. From a reluctant shepherd, he became the powerful spokesperson of God, facing the most powerful ruler in the known world with courage and confidence in the word of the Lord. The story of the confrontation with Pharaoh and the Exodus would become central to Israel's identity as a nation. The Passover, instituted on that fateful night in Egypt, would become an annual celebration, a perpetual reminder of God's deliverance and His covenant faithfulness. As the Israelites left Egypt, they carried with them not only the spoils of the Egyptians, but also a new understanding of who their God was. The Lord had demonstrated His power in ways they would never forget. The liberation from Egypt was just the beginning of Israel's journey. Under Moses' leadership, the people now faced the challenge of crossing the wilderness toward the Promised Land. This journey would be marked by extraordinary miracles, severe trials, and deep lessons about trust and obedience to God. The first major test came right after leaving Egypt. Exodus 14:9 describes the desperate situation in which the Israelites found themselves. The Egyptians pursued them with all Pharaoh's horses and chariots, horsemen and troops, and overtook them as they camped by the sea near Pi-hahiroth, opposite Baal-zephon. Trapped between the Egyptian army and the Red Sea, the people panicked. In verses 11 and 12 they cried out to Moses, "Was it because there were no graves in Egypt that you brought us to the desert to die? What have you done to us by bringing us out of Egypt? Didn't we say to you in Egypt, 'Leave us alone, let us serve the Egyptians'? It would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians than to die in the desert." Moses' response in verse 14 reveals his growing faith and leadership. "Do not be afraid. Stand firm, and you will see the deliverance the Lord will bring you today. The Egyptians you see today, you will never see again." What followed was one of the most dramatic miracles recorded in the Bible. In verse 21 we read, "Then Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and the Lord drove the sea back with a strong east wind all night, and turned the sea into dry land. The waters were divided." This miraculous crossing of the Red Sea not only saved the Israelites, but also sealed the fate of the Egyptian army that pursued them. Once the Israelites were safely on the other side, the waters returned to their place, swallowing the pursuers. This pivotal event solidified the people's faith in God, and in Moses, as his chosen leader. Exodus 14:31 records, "And when the Israelites saw the mighty hand of the Lord displayed against the Egyptians, the people feared the Lord, and put their trust in him, and in Moses his servant." However, the euphoria of liberation soon gave way to the challenges of life in the wilderness. Just 3 days after the Red Sea miracle, the people began to grumble against Moses due to the lack of potable water. In Exodus 15:23-25, we see how God provided. When they came to Marah, they could not drink its water because it was bitter. Then Moses cried out to the Lord, and the Lord showed him a piece of wood. He threw it into the water, and the water became fit to drink. This pattern of need, grumbling, and divine provision would repeat many times throughout the wilderness journey. In Exodus 16, facing hunger, the people complained again. God responded with another miracle, manna and quail. In verse 4, God declares, "Then the Lord said to Moses, I will rain down bread from heaven for you. The people are to go out each day and gather enough for that day. In this way, I will test them and see whether they will follow my instructions." The manna, described in verse 31 as white like coriander seed and tasted like wafers made with honey, became the Israelites' staple food during their wilderness journey. This daily provision was a constant reminder of God's faithfulness and a lesson in trust for the people. Another critical test came at Rephidim, where again there was no water. In Exodus 17:5-6, God instructed Moses, "Go out in front of the people, take with you some of the elders of Israel, and take in your hand the staff with which you struck the Nile, and go. I will stand there before you by the rock at Horeb, strike the rock, and water will come out of it for the people to drink." Moses obeyed, and water miraculously flowed from the rock. It was also at Rephidim that Israel faced its first military conflict, a battle against the Amalekites. In verse 11, we see a powerful scene. As long as Moses held up his hands, the Israelites were winning, but whenever he lowered his hands, the Amalekites were winning. With the help of Aaron and Hur, who held up Moses' arms, Israel won the battle. The wilderness journey was not only a series of physical trials, but also a time of spiritual and national formation for Israel. It was during this time that Moses received the laws and ordinances that would shape Israel's identity as a nation. A crucial moment in this process occurred at Mount Sinai. In Exodus 19:5, God declared his purpose for Israel. "Now, if you obey me fully and keep my covenant, then out of all nations you will be my treasured possession, although the whole earth is mine." It was at Sinai that God delivered the 10 Commandments and other laws to Moses. This encounter on the mountain was marked by dramatic manifestations of the divine presence. Exodus 19:18 describes, "Mount Sinai was covered with smoke, because the Lord descended on it in fire. The smoke billowed up from it like smoke from a furnace, and the whole mountain trembled violently." The stay at Sinai was also marked by one of the saddest episodes of the journey, the incident of the golden calf. While Moses was on the mountain receiving God's laws, the people, impatient with his absence, convinced Aaron to make an idol for them to worship. God's wrath burned against the people for this unfaithfulness, and it was only through Moses' intercession that the nation was spared from destruction. This incident demonstrated both the fragility of the people's faith and the importance of Moses' role as a mediator between God and Israel. After Sinai, the journey continued with the construction of the tabernacle, a mobile sanctuary that symbolized God's presence among his people. The detailed instructions for its construction, given by God to Moses, occupy several chapters of the book of Exodus. The wilderness journey was a crucial period of formation for Israel. Through trials and miracles, the people learned to trust in God and live according to His laws. For Moses, it was a time of growth in leadership and intimacy with God. However, this journey also revealed the weaknesses and rebellion of the people. Repeatedly, they complained and doubted, testing the patience of both God and Moses. These experiences shaped the character of Israel and established patterns of relationship with God that would endure for generations. As the narrative of the desert journey unfolds, we see Moses growing into his role as leader and mediator. He intercedes for the people, receives instructions from God, and guides the nation through seemingly impossible challenges. His leadership during this period laid the foundation for the nation that Israel would become. The arrival at Mount Sinai marked a crucial turning point in Israel's history and Moses' leadership. It was here that God formally established His covenant with the people, delivered the 10 Commandments and other laws, and provided detailed instructions for the construction of the tabernacle. This period at Sinai was essential in shaping Israel's identity as a nation and its relationship with God. In the 3rd month after leaving Egypt, the Israelites arrived in the desert of Sinai. The book of Exodus chapter 19 verse 2 tells us, "After they left Rephidim they entered the desert of Sinai, and Israel camped there in front of the mountain." The preparation for meeting God began immediately. In verses 10 and 11, God instructs Moses, "Go to the people and consecrate them today and tomorrow. They must wash their clothes and be ready by the 3rd day, because on that day the Lord will come down on Mount Sinai in the sight of all the people." God's descent on the mountain was an awe-inspiring spectacle. Verse 16 describes the scene. "On the morning of the 3rd day there was thunder and lightning, with a thick cloud over the mountain, and a very loud trumpet blast. Everyone in the camp trembled." This dramatic manifestation of the divine presence made it clear to the people that they stood before the Almighty God. It was in this context of reverent fear that God proclaimed the 10 Commandments. Chapter 20 records these foundational laws that would become the basis of God's covenant with Israel and influence legal and ethical systems for millennia. The 10 Commandments, spoken directly by God to the people, cover the relationship with God: no other gods, no idols, no misuse of God's name, keeping the Sabbath, and the relationship with others. Honor your parents, do not murder, do not commit adultery, do not steal, do not give false testimony, do not covet. The people's reaction to this direct experience with God was one of fear. In verse 19, they said to Moses, "Speak to us yourself, and we will listen. But do not have God speak to us, or we will die." This request firmly established Moses in his role as mediator between God and the people. In the following chapters, God provides Moses with a series of more detailed laws known as the Covenant Code. These laws cover a wide range of social, religious, and ethical issues, providing a framework for Israel's communal life. After receiving these laws, Moses wrote them down and read them to the people. In chapter 24 verse 3, we read the people's response. "The people all responded with one voice, 'Everything the Lord has said, we will do.'" This was a solemn moment of commitment, sealed with a sacrifice and the sprinkling of the blood of the covenant on the people. Moses, along with Aaron, Nadab, Abihu, and 70 of Israel's elders, then ascended the mountain and had an extraordinary experience of God's presence. Verse 10 describes it. "They saw the God of Israel. Under his feet was something like a pavement made of lapis lazuli, as bright blue as the sky itself." Moses was then called to go higher up the mountain, where he remained for 40 days and 40 nights. During this time, he received detailed instructions for the construction of the tabernacle, a mobile sanctuary symbolizing God's presence among the people. Chapters 25-31 provide meticulous instructions for every aspect of the tabernacle: the Ark of the Covenant, the table of the showbread, the lampstand, the altar of incense, the priestly garments, and much more. Every detail had symbolic meaning, reflecting God's holiness and the need for proper approach to Him. However, while Moses was on the mountain, a crisis developed in the camp. The people, impatient with Moses' long absence, persuaded Aaron to make an idol for them to worship. Chapter 32 verse 4 describes the result. He took what they handed him and made it into an idol cast in the shape of a calf, fashioning it with a tool. Then they said, "These are your gods, Israel, who brought you up out of Egypt." When God informed Moses of this apostasy, his anger burned against the people. In verses 9 and 10, God says to Moses, "I have seen these people, and they are a stiff-necked people. Now leave me alone so that my anger may burn against them, and that I may destroy them. Then I will make you into a great nation." This critical moment revealed the depth of Moses' role as an intercessor. He pleaded with God to spare the people, appealing to God's reputation among the nations and his promises to the patriarchs. Verse 14 records the result of this intercession. Then the Lord relented and did not bring on his people the disaster he had threatened. As Moses descended the mountain and personally saw the people's idolatry, he, in his anger, broke the stone tablets containing the 10 Commandments. He then destroyed the golden calf, forced the people to drink the water mixed with the idol's powdered remains, and ordered the Levites to execute the principal instigators of the rebellion. This incident marked a low point in Israel's spiritual journey, but also highlighted the importance of Moses' role as mediator. In the days that followed, Moses again interceded for the people, even offering his own life for theirs. In chapter 32 verse 32, he says to God, "But now, please forgive their sin, but if not, then blot me out of the book you have written." After this crisis, God renewed his covenant with Israel. Moses ascended the mountain once more with new stone tablets, and God rewrote the 10 Commandments. During this time, Moses had a profound experience of God's glory, though he could not see his face directly. When Moses descended from the mountain after this second 40-day stay, his face was radiant to the point that the people were afraid to approach him. This radiance was a visible testimony of his intimate communion with God, and confirmed his authority as leader and mediator. With the covenant renewed, the people began constructing the tabernacle, according to the instructions God had given to Moses. The final chapters of Exodus describe in detail the crafting of each item for the tabernacle and its ultimate assembly. The completion of the tabernacle marked a significant moment in Israel's spiritual journey. Chapter 40 verse 34 describes, "Then the cloud covered the tent of meeting, and the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle." This visible manifestation of God's presence among the people was a powerful confirmation of the covenant, and a sign of his ongoing guidance. The covenant at Sinai and the giving of the law were fundamental events that defined Israel's identity as a nation and its unique relationship with God. Through these events, Moses firmly established himself as the great leader and mediator of Israel, the man who spoke with God face to face as one speaks to a friend. Exodus 33:11. This phase of Moses' life demonstrated both the challenges and privileges of his unique position. He experienced intimate communion with God, received divine revelation, and acted as a vital intercessor for the people. At the same time, he faced the frustration of the people's rebellion and the immense responsibility of leading a newly formed nation. The covenant at Sinai set the standard for Israel's relationship with God for centuries to come. The laws given to Moses would become the foundation of Israelite society and profoundly influence the legal and ethical development of many cultures throughout history. The last years of Moses' life were marked by continuous challenges, difficult decisions, and the preparation of the people to enter the Promised Land. Although Moses would not enter Canaan, his legacy as a leader, prophet and lawgiver would be fundamental in shaping Israel's future. After leaving Mount Sinai, the Israelites continued their journey through the wilderness. The Book of Numbers recounts many of the events of this period, including the wanderings, rebellions, and the gradual preparation for the conquest of Canaan. One of the most significant events of this period was the incident with the spies in Canaan. In Numbers 13, Moses sent 12 spies to explore the land. After 40 days, they returned with a mixed report. Although the land was rich and fertile, 10 of the spies discouraged the conquest, citing the strength of its inhabitants. Only Joshua and Caleb maintained faith in God's promise. The people's reaction to this negative report was one of despair and rebellion. Numbers 14:1-4 recounts, "That night, all the members of the community raised their voices and wept aloud. All the Israelites grumbled against Moses and Aaron, and they said to each other, 'We should choose a leader and go back to Egypt.' This lack of faith had severe consequences. God decreed that generation, with the exception of Joshua and Caleb, would not enter the Promised Land. The Israelites would wander in the wilderness for 40 years, until the rebellious generation had perished. During these years of wandering, Moses faced several challenges to his leadership. One of the most notable was Korah's rebellion, described in Numbers 16. Korah, along with 250 prominent leaders, challenged the authority of Moses and Aaron. The divine response was dramatic. The ground opened and swallowed the rebels. Another significant incident was Aaron's budding staff, recorded in Numbers 17. To confirm Aaron's divine selection as high priest, God caused his staff, among the staffs of all the tribal leaders, to sprout, blossom, and produce almonds overnight. Despite his notable faithfulness and leadership, Moses also made mistakes. The incident at Meribah, described in Numbers 20, was particularly crucial. When the people once again complained about the lack of water, God instructed Moses to speak to the rock. Instead, frustrated with the people's constant rebellion, Moses struck the rock twice with his staff. Although water flowed, this disobedience came at a great cost to Moses. In verses 12-13, God declared, "But the Lord said to Moses and Aaron, 'Because you did not trust in me enough to honor me as holy in the sight of the Israelites, you will not bring this community into the land I give them.'" As the 40-year journey neared its end, Moses began preparing the new generation to enter Canaan. He led Israel in victories over the kings Sihon and Og, establishing Israelite control over territories east of the Jordan River. Moses also appointed Joshua as his successor. In Numbers 27:18-20 we read, "So the Lord said to Moses, 'Take Joshua son of Nun, a man in whom is the spirit of leadership, and lay your hand on him. Have him stand before Eleazar the priest, and the entire assembly, and commission him in their presence.'" Moses' final speeches, recorded in the book of Deuteronomy, are a powerful recapitulation of the law and Israel's history. In these speeches, Moses retells the people's journeys, reaffirms the covenant with God, and exhorts the new generation to be faithful. In Deuteronomy 30:19-20, Moses makes a final appeal to the people. "This day I call the heavens and the earth as witnesses against you, that I have set before you life and death, blessings and curses. Now choose life, so that you and your children may live, and that you may love the Lord your God, listen to his voice, and hold fast to him, for the Lord is your life." Deuteronomy chapter 32 contains the Song of Moses, a prophetic poem that recounts God's faithfulness and Israel's failures, serving as a testimony for future generations. In chapter 33, Moses pronounces blessings on the tribes of Israel, much like the blessings of Jacob in Genesis 49. These final words reflect his deep concern and love for the people he had led for so many years. Finally, we come to the moment of Moses' death. Deuteronomy 34:1-5 narrates, "Then Moses climbed Mount Nebo from the plains of Moab to the top of Pisgah across from Jericho. There the Lord showed him the whole land. Then the Lord said to him, 'This is the land I promised on oath to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, when I said, I will give it to your descendants. I have let you see it with your eyes, but you will not cross over into it.' And Moses, the servant of the Lord, died there in Moab, as the Lord had said." Although he did not enter the promised land, Moses was given the privilege of seeing it from afar. His death on Mount Nebo marks the end of an era and the beginning of another in Israel's history. The legacy of Moses is immeasurable. He is remembered as the great deliverer, the lawgiver, the prophet, who spoke with God face to face. The final verses of Deuteronomy summarize his greatness. Since then, no prophet has risen in Israel like Moses, whom the Lord knew face to face, who did all those signs and wonders. For no one has ever shown the mighty power or performed the awesome deeds that Moses did in the sight of all Israel. Deuteronomy 34:10-12. Moses' influence extended far beyond his own lifetime. The laws he delivered formed the foundation of Israelite society for centuries. His leadership during the Exodus and the wilderness journey became a paradigm of liberation and nation-building. His writings, known as the Pentateuch or Torah, became the cornerstone of Jewish scriptures and, later on, an integral part of the Christian Bible. In Jewish tradition, Moses is revered as the greatest of the prophets. In Christianity, he is seen as a forerunner of Jesus Christ, with parallels drawn between the liberation from Egypt and spiritual salvation. In Islam, Moses, Musa, is respected as a significant prophet and messenger of God. The story of Moses continues to inspire people from all walks of life. His journey from a baby saved from the waters to the leader of a nation, his closeness to God, his challenges and triumphs, offer powerful lessons about faith, leadership, and perseverance. Moses remains a central figure in the history of monotheistic faith, a man whose life and legacy continue to shape religious and ethical thought to this day. His story is a lasting testimony to the power of God to use ordinary people to accomplish his extraordinary purposes in human history. If you've watched this video all the way through, I hope you enjoyed it. Please share and like, it will help me a lot. Thank you so much for watching, and may God bless you. Amen.